So the French economy was booming in the 1960s, but as often happens when we have a booming economy, that didn't necessarily mean that all jobs were equal, or that everyone had particularly good jobs. What we started to see in French society in the post-war period, and it's accelerated during the 1960s, is the collapse of the number of people working as farmers, working in agriculture, working on the land. There's a slow but steady growth in the number of people working in industry. That peaks at about 38% by 1970 in France, and after that actually begins to decline again. So we never really have more than half the French workforce, or in fact we never even get to half the French workforce working in industry. Where many of the French people end up working, if you can guess from where I'm going with the image on the screen here, is in the service industry. There's a vast expanse of the people working in the service industry, various white-collar jobs in the 1960s. So by 1970, over 50% of the French labour force is working in the service industry. And what we also start to see is the dying away of more traditional family-run French businesses, French shops, French cafes, small French firms, family farms, being increasingly replaced by larger and larger conglomerates or larger and larger business entities that buy up their competitors. Now, if you go to France today, you'll still find that compared to the United States, there are a lot more small businesses still in France. But this was a marked turn in the 1960s where, up until that period of time, it was very rare to find many businesses beyond medium-sized firms, and family farms, family businesses of all kinds of stripes were very, very common. We also get a growing kind of divide in the amongst French labourers in the French working class. Increasingly, there's a growing divide between skilled labour positions and unskilled labour positions. And many of the working class, even though they are able to, because of the rise in wages, are able to buy some of the new material goods. So, for example, by mid-1970s, over half the French population own a car, which obviously includes many of the ordinary working class people. They also find that their children tend to be less likely to go on to university education than from those from the middle class or the bourgeoisie. And in talking about working class politics, it's also worth bearing in mind that there was still a lot of division within various left-wing circles or representatives of the working class in France. In the past, we've talked about the divisions within the French trade union section between the Confédération Générale du Travail, which was dominated by the communists, and it still was in the 1960s. A more moderate version, the Confédération Générale du Travail Force Ouvrière, the workers' force, very similar name, was a much more moderate trade union. And then in the 1960s, a new trade union emerged from an older Catholic trade union tradition, the Confédération Française Démocratique du Travail, the Confederation of French Democratic Workers. And so the left was kind of very divided amongst itself, the organised left, the trade unions, about which policy they should follow, and therefore, compared to other countries like the United Kingdom or Germany, for example, where there was much more kind of political cohesion amongst the working class voters, that didn't really exist to the same extent in France. France itself was actually, let me just skip to our next Jeopardy question as a way of introducing our next section. I guess I've already given you the answer. So this Parisian centre, which houses the French Museum of Modern Art, is named after this politician, who is Georges Pompidou. So who is Georges Pompidou? Well, Georges Pompidou was originally a professor of literature who had gone into business in the 1950s, and eventually become the secretary of Charles de Gaulle. In 1962, with the Algerian crisis behind France, with Charles de Gaulle having succeeded in changing the presidential election to direct elections, he decided to appoint Georges Pompidou as his prime minister. And I think nothing speaks better to the changes that have been brought about by Charles de Gaulle's Fifth Republic, but than the fact that Pompidou was to reign as prime minister of France for 6 years, which is still the record. And to put that into perspective, during the 70 years of the Third Republic, no one cabinet lasted longer than 4 years. So Pompidou remains prime minister for 4 years. In fact, no cabinet in the Third Republic had ever even reached 4 years in duration, which was supposed to be the mandated length of term. So Pompidou becomes prime minister. He's kind of very much de Gaulle's right-hand man. And so the Gaullist policies of French independence on the international stage, and a strong government role in creating a more modernized economy continue to dominate French politics, especially as the political left is really not in a position to kind of challenge them. However, what is upcoming is an election. In 1965, France is scheduled to have its first ever, not its first ever, because we had the same thing back in the old Second Republic in 1848, but for the first time in a long, long time, a presidential election in which the people themselves will directly elect the president. Charles de Gaulle decides to run for president again, even though by this stage he's well into his mid-70s, but insists on running again. And he is pretty confident. He doesn't really campaign. He's very, very confident, in fact, he's going to win the election. He doesn't make much effort to try and appeal to the French people. His feeling is basically that his body of work in the creation of the French Republic and the successful economy that has emerged in the 1960s speaks volumes to his qualifications as president. But he does actually face two challengers, François Mitterrand and Jean Lacunaye. So Mitterrand was a French socialist, although he was not a member of the French Socialist Party, which actually was one of his advantages. The political left, so I talked about the divisions amongst the French trade unions. The French political left was also divided as a result of the kind of bitter animosity from the Algerian War, where a lot of people on the left, I mentioned that group, the second left, felt that the French, the Communist Party and especially the Socialist Party had sold out their values by collaborating with the army to try and suppress the rebellion in Algeria. Mitterrand was trying to unite the communists and the socialists together, and his main advantage was the fact that he was not a member of either party, and in that sense he had more kind of broad left-wing appeal than a more traditional leader of either the Socialist Party or the Communist Party. Jean Lacunaye was much more of a centrist, was very much campaigning as a centrist. His big philosophical difference with de Gaulle was regarding de Gaulle's attitude towards the United States. De Gaulle, as we've already seen, was quite antagonistic to the United States at times. Jean Lacunaye felt that was wrong, that the United States was France's best ally. It made more sense to have a more open relationship with France, with the United States, than a kind of adversarial relationship that de Gaulle at times seemed to enjoy adopting. What was also notable, as I said, de Gaulle himself didn't really campaign. Lacunaye had adopted American-style campaigning, which meant not just a variety of public appearances, but also being quite aggressive in his attacks on de Gaulle. And actually, the French media at the time was largely controlled by the French government, and so a lot of people were shocked to hear very suddenly these very, very direct critical attacks upon de Gaulle by both Lacunaye and Mitterrand as well. And the result was it had an effect. So when the election was held in 1965, under the system that de Gaulle created with the Fifth Republic, the idea was that the president was elected by popular vote, but the president had to have at least 50% of the popular vote to get a mandate. And so what that meant was that there would be possibly more than one round of voting in France. That if no single candidate secured more than 50% in the first round, that would produce a runoff between the two candidates that received the highest number of votes. And in the first round, to kind of a lot of people's surprise, Charles de Gaulle did not receive more than 50% of the vote. So the vote was divided between Mitterrand, or the opposition was divided between Mitterrand and Lacunaye. Mitterrand, obviously, as you can see from the screen here, had the second highest number of votes, and that meant that he went into a direct runoff with de Gaulle himself. That kind of in some ways roused de Gaulle out of his political stupor. He became more active in campaigning during the second round, and usually there's about 2 weeks between the first and second round, insisting on that only he could kind of continue France on its forward path in terms of its economic development. And the result was basically, essentially the two men split. You could argue they split Lacunaye's vote, although de Gaulle emerged with a much higher percentage of the vote on the second round and acquired 55% of the population. So under those terms, he became president again and was due to serve until 1972, by which time he would be well into his 80s. Let's just take a look at, this is the division of between Charles de Gaulle and Francois Mitterrand. You can see it's mostly in the south that Mitterrand has the majority, and most of northern, western and central France voting for Charles de Gaulle. But there were, even in the French right, there were those voices that were somewhat critical, or at least suggested that Gaullism, as it was defined, was not necessarily the best answer for France. And one of the most outspoken critics of de Gaulle in that sense was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. So he was a supporter of de Gaulle, but more of a moderate supporter. And his biggest disagreement with de Gaulle was around managing the economy. That Giscard d'Estaing was a big believer in free market economy, or at least that the idea that the government should have less of a significant hands-on centralizing role in the economy than the French Gaullists were prepared to advocate for. And so during the next election, the next legislative election in 1967, Giscard d'Estaing and his independent Republicans said, okay, well, their basic attitude was, we agree with de Gaulle, but our philosophy is yes, but. That when de Gaulle proposes something, oftentimes we kind of agree with what he's saying, but we feel he needs to moderate his policies, and in particular take more steps to, on the one, be more accommodating to the United States, and the second step to have the government step back from the economy and allow more free market forces to help further promote French economic growth. And the result was, in the elections of 1967, as a kind of sign of de Gaulle's decreasing influence on French society, we get so the union of de Gaulle's party, the presidential majority, manages to get a majority, but it's a relatively small majority, and actually it's, in some ways it's helped by votes from France's overseas territories as opposed to votes in metropolitan France itself. Mitterrand was trying to bring the French Communist Party and the French Socialist Party together behind his leadership, but the two parties are still, have decades of suspicion around working with one another. But what we start to see is that de Gaulle's influence is starting to decrease. That in the election to introduce the Constitution for the Fifth Republic, we had over 80% of the population supported it. In the referendum to create direct presidential elections in 1962, we get 60% of the population supporting it. Then in de Gaulle's own presidential election, as you saw, the first round, that support fell to 45%. And here we have a basic majority, pretty close to about 50% of the population kind of support de Gaulle's policies. Well, that shows a kind of declining support for him. And in fact, what marked a kind of weariness with de Gaulle, especially, he's quite an old man at this stage, and there's a growing desire to see something new, something different. Although no one appreciated in 1967 just how radical that demand, just how sudden that demand, just how revolutionary that demand would emerge the following year to the point in which it almost toppled the Fifth Republic. So we'll talk about more of that in the next section.